Okay. Oh, hello.
Hi.
To start out with, would you just like to say your name and where you are?
Yeah, my name is Chantelle Wyley, and I'm speaking from Cape Town in South Africa.
Hmm. It's nice to meet you. This has only been
Mm.
email so far, so it's nice to put a face.
Yeah, yeah.
The first question that I have for you is pretty much right to the point. It is, who are you as a person, as a human being? And you can take that to your qualities, your values, your passions, your interests, whatever you would like to.
Mm. And it's a good identity question too. Yeah. And in this day and age of Black Lives Matter and exploring whiteness, it's something I've been thinking about. So I'm a South African. And I'm a white South African, which has a particular set of connotations around it. And I grew up in the 1970s, the 60s and 70s, which is really the height of apartheid South Africa, with a very particular influence and consciousness. So I think, Heather, when you ask me who am um, I think at my heart, I'm an activist. That's how I move in the world. That's how I see myself. And after a fairly quiet childhood, I'm also quite an introvert, which is interesting. I got to understand and to see the enormous injustices that were happening around me. And as I went to university, I went very young to university at the age of 17, and I got involved in anti-apartheid politics, student politics, and that has pretty much characterized my life since then. And I resonate very much with the activism in Gestalt, and the fact that Fritz Perls allegedly said that through getting individuals to function healthily, we would have a healthily functioning society, something like that. And I resonated deeply with that. And most of the work that I do is in government in South Africa, where we have the overall kind of imperative and mission to transform the state to something that serves the citizenry in a more meaningful way. So 20 years ago or 15 years ago, when I started working in government, 15 years ago, it was about transforming the apartheid state into something that was more responsive to the majority of the population. And these days it's gotten more complex because it also has all the tendrils of corruption and all of that sort of thing tied in with the race-based politics, and also the politics of poverty and inequality. So I'm an activist. I'm also a great reader. My first career was as a librarian, so my introvert was doing a thing there. And then sort of I got out into the field and started working with different communities on the east coast of South Africa, around information provision to communities to empower their development decisions. And that's how I got into training. And through being a trainer and working in development, I encountered Gestalt and did the international IOSD program in 1995. So the activism, the reading, the love of knowledge, the love of literature, the love of good writing, the love of eloquent and elegant expression, all of that is part of me. Mm.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. Well, another question that we do have is whether you identify a particular event or a circumstance, maybe expanding on what you already mentioned, but that has defined who you are and how.
Yes, I can. So I talked about growing up in South Africa in the 60s and 70s, which was a very segregated situation. The only Black people of color that we knew were people who worked as domestic servants or worked in the service industry, and usually at a fairly low level. So that was part of our socialization. I lived in a completely white neighborhood, went to a completely white school. And when I was about 11 years old, and of course, there was all of the propaganda and the censorship. So nothing about Nelson Mandela was allowed to be said in the media. His picture was banned, his writings were banned, and all the other people that were involved with the anti-apartheid movement. And one day when I was about 11 or 12, and television was quite new in South Africa, and there'd been something on the TV about Mandela, and the apartheid nationalist state were busy convincing everybody that Mandela was a communist, and that was the height of the Cold War, and civilization as we know it would collapse in Africa if we let all these communists out of jail, that kind of thing. And something was sort of coming out of the television to that effect. And my grandfather, who I absolutely loved, turned around and said to me, "You do know that Mandela is not a communist." And I sort of looked at him. I didn't know how. I remember very distinctly. The memory is very clear. I'm thinking, where did that come from? Because I wasn't really listening to the TV. It was sort of there in the background. And he said to me, "And I know that because I've met him." And I was like, oh, my grandfather's met a famous person. I knew who Mandela was. Mm-hmm. And then he told me the story that when he worked in Johannesburg in the early 50s, he was working for an office machinery company that sold dictaphones, those old things that the bosses used to speak into, and then the secretaries could listen and do the typing. He sold those machines to officers. And he got a job to install dictaphone machines in Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo's law office in downtown Johannesburg. And he went there and he was busy doing this piece of work. And he had a conversation with Nelson Mandela. My grandfather was a very chatty person. He would talk to anybody. Everybody was interesting to him. And he had a long conversation with Mandela. And then, these years later, he says to his little grandchild, to me, I've spoken to him, and I know how he thinks, and this is what we spoke about, and he's not the person the television tells you he is. He's not the person, the Nats, that was his derogatory nickname for the National Party government, he's not the person the Nats tell you he is. And I think for me, in Gestalt terms, this was my first big lesson in multiple realities. That there is not one truth, that there are two truths. And I got very, very curious. And because I think I had developed a tendency to want to, after that, and but later, to want to be different, I was always looking for the other story, even from quite a small child. And I was probably quite difficult for the adults in my family as well, because I understood now that there were often 2, 3, or 4 stories to things. So it was easy for me when I came to university, where the environment was more liberal and radical, and there was more truths available, that I could start to entertain those and understand them, and see that there was a whole world or a whole understanding of what was going on in South Africa that had been hidden from me. But the first clue that this was a possibility was in this conversation from my grandfather, which is it's very precious for me, and it's interesting that I remember it so clearly.
Mm-hmm. That's lovely. It's just like, I can imagine the feeling of just the mind opening up and going, oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, another question that we have is if I also would say identify a particular person who you've met in the course of your life who has really influenced or impacted who you are, and how.
There are quite a few. And my grandfather, who I've just been talking about, was one, because of his kind of curiosity with everybody. And I've learned sometimes to channel that in my work. I think there were a couple of teachers that I'm going to name a couple of people, I think, because they, in a way, I think they gave me similar things, but in different ways. But I had a couple of teachers who were extraordinarily interesting. I had a German history teacher in high school, and we were doing stuff, like Hitler's rise to power and, Soviet Russia. All of that was in a very sanitized way in the curriculum. And she had this heavy German accent, and she was clearly Jewish. And we knew she'd grown up in Germany. So this was in like 1975, 76, 77. So she must have been some kind of refugee as a small child from the Nazis. And we kept asking her questions about this, and she would never tell us. So I think it's something about this mystery that history was not only what was in this dry old textbook, it was actually something that could impact on people's lives. And I think that got me really curious about human beings. And I think she would giggle today, because I still read a lot of books about Nazi history and Soviet history, because I'm very interested in the social psychology of those phenomena, not so much as a historian anymore, although I studied history at university. And then there are people in the Gestalt world who I carry with me all the time. Edwin Nevis, Sonia Nevis. Sonia, because of her elegance and her femininity and her down-to-earthness and her huge heart and her ability to really believe in people. I actually feel a bit teary as I talk about her, and how she helped me to find confidence in myself. But I think the quirkiest story, and probably a person who was in a mysterious way very impactful for me, was a guy who I met who taught politics at the university when I worked there as a librarian, a guy called Ian Phillips. And he was a white South African who grew up in a working class family. Was very brilliant, was the first in his family to go to university, had a doctorate in politics and sociology by the time he was 25. He was a very odd man. He was gay, but very much in the closet, a little bit, brilliant up here, but completely out of touch with himself. But he was an underground activist for the ANC in the 1980s at the university. And he soon discovered that I was an ally, because I was in the library, and the library had banned books that I could get access to as a librarian, but he couldn't without permission from the Minister of Police. So I used to steal these books from the library, and then he used to read them and hand them out to all the students and the underground ANC operatives that were operating in and around the university. And after liberation, he became an advisor to one of the cabinet ministers. And he was an extraordinary man, because he was so brilliant, so out of touch with himself, so dedicated to the spirit of revolution, quite an odd human being in a way. And I think he stays with me quite a lot, because he died of AIDS in 2004. And just, is quite a loss, because a lot of the very brilliant early days of the ANC government he contributed to. And he gave me a kind of a place in the changing of history, and got me to work a lot with his students and that sort of thing. So he's somebody I hold quite close to me, and I'm very sorry he's not around. Yeah.
It's interesting when you start speaking of losses, I sort of become aware of your age, and I'm wondering how you're feeling with yourself in the age that you are now.
Yeah, I'm 57. I'll be 58 next month. I'm very relieved I'm not young anymore. Some of that angst and, I like where I am mentally at the moment. When I was a bit younger, sort of in my late 40s, when I started to teach in the world of Gestalt. I joined the faculty of the IOSD program, and I was one of the younger faculty members. And Edwin one day, I was saying something about something, and Edwin turned around, Edwin Nevis, in a very snide way, looked at me and he said, "Oh, so you finally decided to step into your power?" And he said it to me in a quite a like snippy way. I was completely bowled over, and yeah, I was like, okay, yeah, get with the plot. Yeah, you're at the point in your life where you need to acknowledge that you have power and influence. You know, you can't skulk around on the boundary forever of things, which interestingly is part of what anti-apartheid whites in South Africa do. Like my friend Ian, he always said he was a backroom boy in the ANC, but he authored some of their biggest and most fantastic policy documents, but he did it from behind. In fact, his boss, the cabinet minister he worked for, was the ANC's head of policy development. And I absolutely know that Ian wrote half of the stuff that came out of that office, that political office. But he always said, I'm a backroom boy, you know, I don't want to be in the spotlight. So a lot of us whites in South Africa, we like, this is, you know, it's not our place to be on the stage because that's not appropriate. But Edwin gave me a bit of a kick with that. So that's where I am at the moment. I'm thinking about what is my influence, what is my power, what is my, I'm not quite at a legacy phase yet. I think I don't want to go there yet. But there is something about what are you actually doing, and what do you want to be doing for the next 5 years? And this whole COVID lockdown situation is a big time to ask these questions, because I was thinking, you know, I'm going to carry on being on the faculty of the iGold program, which is the program that succeeded the IOSD program, the Gestalt Organization Leadership Development Program. It's a 2-year program. It runs every 2 years. I was like, okay, I'll always be doing that. And that means traveling every 3 or 4 months. It means recruiting Africans to be part of that program. Yeah, you know, this was my life. And suddenly, okay, I have the skill, I have this mission, I have this work that I do. So how do I do it now? And that's I think that's the question for me at the moment. It's partly age, and it's partly the world we live in. Yeah.
Okay. And the last of the more personal questions before we get a bit into your Gestalt life would be how you understand or live yourself as a woman, or in your gender, or in your femininity.
Yeah, it's a question about presence. Also, it's a question about identity and a question about presence. It's an interesting question for me, because I'm not. Even at university, I was less interested in feminist politics, and you know, kind of read Germaine Greer, and I read all of, you know, that kind of stuff, which felt like it was saying something cognitively interesting and relevant to me, but it felt very far away. It didn't feel like it belonged in the reality where I was. It felt European, it felt American. So my primary identity was more about being an activist, and that didn't have a whole lot to do with the fact that I was a woman. But it was interesting for me to have children. I have 2 daughters who are now in their early 20s, and there was something really profound that happened to me with motherhood. Since I was 21, I'd been practicing yoga, and a lot of my way of framing how I deal with my body is through the power and the strength it can get from yoga, and from what yoga can do in pregnancy to help generate a human being that is sort of, healthy and energetically wonderful and all of that. So when you talk to me about my gender, I go to those places, to the body, to the expression, to my physical abilities in terms of strength and flexibility and those kinds of things. The other thing I go to is a question about power. I'm very well aware in many of the client systems in which I work, which some of them are very male dominated and very African male dominated, with particular identities around masculinity and femininity. I often know that I have to use the fact that I'm a woman in a particular way, even down to things like wearing dresses and not trousers in some more traditional contexts, and being probably a little bit more polite and even a little bit more submissive than usual on entering such systems, and then knowing that I need to find a way to bring my power, my expertise, my abilities to support the system to learn what it needs to do. So I think despite myself, I do use my femininity, my definition as a woman, as part of my presence. But I don't always make it figural in that sense. I think privately, with my children, this is where I am very homely, cuddly. But I think when I'm in the world of work, I think I carry my intellect to the fore, which often for me has a little bit of a kind of a masculine definition to it.
Okay. Well, the next question would be, you touched on it a little bit, but how did you come into Gestalt through all of this history that you've been explaining?
Yeah. So in 1995, I was working for a development project in Durban, which is on the east coast of South Africa. And this project was sponsored by the German government's development cooperation funding. It was one of the first in South Africa because the German government didn't directly operate with South Africa under apartheid. But the guy who ran the project had been living as an ANC exile in Zimbabwe, and he'd got funding from the Germans there. So he came to South Africa, he came back home to South Africa, opened this project, and the Germans funded it. And one day he said to me, would you like to go on a training program? The Germans are offering it and whatever. Anyway, I went off on this training program, and that's where I met Jochen, my husband. And he was one of the trainers on this program, and it was a fairly long program. It was about 2.5 weeks long, and all these South Africans that were part of these projects that the Germans were supporting in the early days of our new government. And this was in April of 1995, and the second international OSD program, which Edwin ran with John O'Hanifin and Claire Stratford, was due to start in the May, and Jochen had signed up for it, and I think his interview will tell you the story, with a colleague called Shirley Wouters, who was a Canadian. She lived in Berlin, and she was married to Hartmut Fresch, who was a professor of Gestalt at the Berlin University. So Gestalt was very much in that world. And Shirley had come to Jochen and a couple of others and said, I've found the program for us to go to. And a whole lot of them had signed up for this program. And while we were there here in South Africa on this training program where I met Jochen, one of the people, a Filipino colleague who'd signed up as part of this group, said she couldn't make it. So Jochen let Edwin know, and then Edwin said, well, have you got somebody else? So he looked around this group of people in the training program, and there was myself and another colleague, Celeste Fenter, and somebody else. And he said to a couple of us, are you interested? I thought, well, I didn't even know how to spell Gestalt. I didn't know what it was. But I liked Jochen, obviously. And I sort of, he explained a little bit to me. And then I said, yeah, well, okay, I'm not doing anything on the 23rd of May. And you know, my boss said, oh, that's fine, you know, you just take unpaid leave and you can go. And so I was actually given a scholarship on that program by Edwin. He gave myself and John Nkum from Ghana scholarships, and both of us went on to teach with Edwin on the faculty of the program, and we're still together as members of the faculty of the iGold program. So we always used to say to Edwin, you made a good investment in us too. Yeah, you gave us a scholarship to do the program, and we're still here supporting it years later. So yeah, so I did the IOSD program and was completely captivated by what this body of theory and practice meant for the work that I was doing. I wasn't doing coaching, I wasn't doing anything like that, but I was going into systems that were very different culturally and kind of sector knowledge-wise different to my own. And what I learned from that program about how to enter and how to watch my own process on the boundary of those systems was enormously important for me. And then I started working with Jochen and John, and yeah, that's how we got into Gestalt. And then I sort of worked backwards, unlike most, you know, many of my colleagues who work in Gestalt OD have had some sort of therapeutic training. I went backwards, and we took ourselves off and did the Cape Cod model training program, which of course in the first and second modules is mostly, you know, a lot of organizational people do it now, but in those days it was mainly therapists. And then they added the piece onto the Cape Cod model program, which is about working in organizations and working with coaching. But yeah, that's how I got into it.
And is there a particular aspect of Gestalt that attracts you or captivated you? What specifically is it that caught your attention?
I think it was this acute and sensitive consciousness about what it means to be on the boundary. Just that concept, this definition of an intervener. You know, we were thinking of, oh, I'm a development facilitator. And that sort of said, okay, you stand in front of the group and you get their information and you summarize it on the flip chart and you write a report for them and you give it back. That was kind of what we were working with. So this notion that being on the boundary and not taking responsibility for the outcome, that was massive for me, because working as I was in some poor communities, I felt very responsible as the white person. These people are poor. These people don't have access to information. You know, these people, they are the other. Now I've got to come here and help them. So I was unconsciously in quite a rescuer activist position. And the definitions that Gestalt give us about what it means to be on the boundary and to be supporting, encouraging, observing, noticing, heightening awareness, all of those things, was a big wake-up call for me. It was a big check for me to understand my own process and to enter the system with softer eyes, if you like, to use that analogy. And the second thing is, Heather, was about a similar point about presence, about for me to suddenly get much more technically and aesthetically aware of who I am as a white person working in systems which are mainly with Black people, with Black colleagues, or diverse groups. What it means to come in and what my presence might evoke in them, and how I could use my presence in service of the work. And this was enormously important in my own personal process around race and whiteness. And I was in very stark situations often, working in villages with no electricity, with people who couldn't speak English. I was working with a translator who was translating everything I said into Zulu, drawing pictures on flip charts all the time, having the women sit in the corner and the men sit over there, and I had to wear a skirt, and in those days I was always wearing trousers, and it was, you know, and really dealing with a lot of the patriarchy of Zulu culture, and thinking about how do I need to be of service to this system, and what does that mean, and where do the responsibilities lie, was enormously useful and important.
Mm. Hmm. And how would you say that being involved with Gestalt has affected you as a person?
Yeah,
I mean, I do understand that what you're saying is how it's affected your work, but it's and a lot of reflecting on yourself as well. But as a person, how would you say has it affected you?
Yeah, I'm recalling a close friend of mine now who gave me some feedback with her, which I think relates to this. So I was in high school with her, and then we went separately off to university. And in I did a 3-year degree, and then I came down to Cape Town and did a year postgraduate diploma, and I shared an apartment with her. And then we went our separate ways. So in our early 20s, and she went to work in Malaysia, whatever. And in 2005, which was quite a long time later, we bumped into each other again when she came back to South Africa and got a job in Cape Town. And it was around that time that Jochen and I invited John O'Hanifin and Marianne Rainey to come to Cape Town and run a week-long introduction to Gestalt. And this friend of mine, Dorothy, was helping me with that. She's a media person, and she was helping me with some of the marketing. And she, during the process of that, when I was talking to her about Gestalt, and I think I was introducing her to maybe to Marianne or Jono, but she turned around and made this comment. She said, if Gestalt can do what it's done for Chantelle, then I'm going to be in. And I asked her a while after that, I said, what was it that you saw? And it was something, I don't remember her exact words, but my recollection of it was like it speeded up my maturity as a human being. And somebody else once gave me the feedback that I was 10 years more mature than most other people that they knew at 45 or whatever I was at that stage. So I think there's, and I'm saying that not in a casual way, oh, you're more mature than your age or something. I'm saying it in view of all the research in constructive development theory about adult development maturity levels. And there's something that the key sort of factor in people moving up levels in maturity is about the ability to take in and integrate what we would say in Gestalt is different data sets or different kinds of data. So being able to integrate tensions and polarities. So not living in a world of it's this or that, it's this and that, and I can live with both, and I can live with the indecisiveness and the discomfort of both. So the development of a rich inner world of complexity is what the constructive development theorists are talking about. And that's what Gestalt gave me. I think I was able to process some of the complexity of living in South Africa, to hold all the complexities of being white, of having a political role, of being important and have expertise, and actually being not important because this is a struggle run, you know, in terms of Black liberation or the liberation of all the oppressed groups in South Africa, which definitely wasn't me. I grew up in a place of privilege. So what does that mean? You know, what does value mean? What does worth mean? What does agency mean in that situation? And I was able, I think, in a very personal sense, to integrate that and to work with it in a way that was powerful for me as a person, powerful for my children. They get a lot of feedback about how non-racial they are in the way that they operate in the world, how aware they are, how you know, heart and mind are integrated in the way they are in the world. So it's made a real difference to me and family and people that I work with. That's been important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that you feel part of a Gestalt community? What does that phrase mean to you?
That's an interesting question, Heather, because I think generally South Africans feel quite far away from the rest of the world. And I don't know, I haven't really spoken to any Australians whether it's worse for them because they kind of double the distance.
They do.
um, so, so there's always a feeling of being a little bit exceptional, I think, in Africa, and a little bit sensitive um, when there are assumptions around life as being westernized, US centric, European centric, English centric, etc. But I think Jochen and I have worked very hard, and I would include John and Koum in this very particularly as well. We've worked really hard to at great expense to go to trainings in the US. You know, John's done a lot of he did a lot of programs at the Institute of Cleveland. He did a lot of programs with John Carter. Jochen and I went to the Cape Cod quite often. We've done programs in Europe. So we have shown up in the very traditional bastions of Gestalt in the US and in Europe. And we've brought our stories, we've brought our application of the theory and practice. So we've joined communities in a very deliberate way, I think, because we have been looking for community, and we've created communities here. So, you know, I developed a little course on an introduction to Gestalt for managers and leaders. I thought it was quite weird. The first time I ran it in a 2-day program, I had like 5 people, and they told people, and they told people. And I've probably, maybe 400 people have been through that little 2-day program. And it's really to give some psychological models for people who work with people, to have a frame to be able to understand change and resistance and awareness and whatever. So through that, I've created a community, and we've brought the trainers who've been influential for us to Africa and given people here an exposure. So we've created a bit of a community here in South Africa, and we've made an effort to be connected to other communities. I do feel disadvantaged by the exchange rate because things are so expensive. We have a very dollar poor currency here in South Africa. So what I earn and then have to pay for a program in the US is it's exorbitant for me. So we do feel a little bit disadvantaged in that sense. The distance makes us disadvantaged, especially for programs that are like a weekend in Cleveland every 3rd month. You know, we can't do that because it's too far to travel. But you know, we don't sit in a place of kind of victim about that. We've made an effort, and there's this organization mainly based in Europe, in Tagio, the International Association of Gestalt in Organizations, and I've been on the executive committee of that for about 3-4 years. Jochen's been very active, so we've kind of I want to say sort of inserted ourselves, but we've helped to create communities where we can find a place and a home. And Jochen and I have been to every, I think, except the first one, every Intagio general meeting. We have one a year for 4 or 5 days, and we prioritize that in terms of our financial investment. And even when we were both living in South Africa, we would go to these every year. Because it was important for us to contribute, to be heard, and also to be part of people who live and work in the way of Gestalt.
I do also want to ask you specifically about the nature of what you feel like your work is. with Gestalt? I know that you're involved with development and with organizations, and I'm interested in how you would describe your work, what you do with Gestalt.
Yeah. So let me start with the systems. So I coach individuals and teams, and I work in bigger system change from organizations to large system, not so often, but so most of the leaders I coach are senior leaders, senior managers in the South African government. Some of them head national departments. Some of them head or in the second or third level in provincial departments. Some of them head big government programs, and same with the teams. So I work with teams of sort of 10, 12 people that run big social change initiatives in government on behalf of government. So like unemployment programs. Or city planning support programs. So I coach these teams of people, and I do and then organizational change, which is often a culture change program or a leadership development program, and then the big system change is often about culture change, the culture of government in a province, for example. I do need to say that, you know, that Gestalt is the way in which I do my work, but I've been enormously supported and influenced by the work in emotional intelligence, which has come out of the Telios Leadership Institute in Philadelphia, which is Annie McKee and Fran Johnson. And Fran is a Gestalt person through and through. She was on the Cleveland OSD faculty. And when Annie and Fran and Telios got a contract from the United Nations Development Program to do leadership development with leaders who were working on HIV and AIDS, they were asked by the UNDP to do this in Cambodia, Swaziland, South Africa, and Trinidad and Tobago. So they called up Edwin and said, do you have any Gestalt people in South Africa? And he said, phone Chantelle. So I got this call one day and said, do you want to be involved? I said, of course I do. And so they came to South Africa and ran this big program for the UN Development Program. And I worked on that with them, and subsequently have the license to run their emotional intelligence programs, and have done, you know, have used that in my work. But the way in which I behave when I'm doing those programs comes absolutely from Gestalt. So that's another kind of community, that Telios community, which is around their work, is very important to me. And most of those people are Gestalt people, have all had Gestalt training. And in fact, Annie and Fran used to send all their new staff members to the IOSD program or the iGold program that I was a faculty member of for their training. That was part of what you needed to work in Telios. So the nature of my work here, that's, you know, I'm doing leadership development, often with emotional intelligence, and then the coaching of teams, the coaching of individuals, the big systems change. Again, I'm very influenced by Annie McKee has a methodology called dynamic inquiry, which is an inquiry system based on appreciative inquiry with a slightly different edge to it. And I use that in a lot of my works. So I really am very indebted and appreciative of my relationship as an associate of Telios. The other little thing that I do is I do quite a lot of teaching in the universities and facilitating in postgraduate programs. So, yeah. Yeah. And some of those are coaching programs, you know, teaching coaches. One of the good business schools here has got an advanced business coaching program, and they want me, come and do Gestalt. We don't care what you do. Here's 4 hours, introduce them to Gestalt as a methodology for coaching. So that's rather fun, in 4 hours to take a group of, you know, senior adults, often business people who want to be coaches, and just shake them up a little bit around Gestalt. So I do that. And then MBA students, master students in public policy, public sector government leadership training. There's a big master's program in the new Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. So I do work around leadership and Gestalt there. So yeah, so I particularly enjoy that. And I'm a bit cheeky in the academic environment because I think academics can be a bit snooty. And I think we in Gestalt know a whole lot more about imparting adult learning than they do. So I love coming into these MBA programs where they get lectures from these very poncy professors, and then I come in and get them to talk to one another and push boundaries with each other and just mess them around a little bit around their assumptions.
Very subversive. Okay, well, another question that I have, almost coming to an end here, would be if you have a particular moment that comes to mind that has been one of the most challenging things that you have gone through, either as a person or in terms of Gestalt, however you want to answer it.
I think what comes to mind for me was this piece of work that I did, started at the end of 2011 and it went through fully in 2012, 2013, and then again a little bit more in 2015 in the Eastern Cape province, which is one of the poorest rural provinces in South Africa. Cape Town's in the Western Cape, and this is to the east of the continent. A person who was a deputy director general in the premier's office there had come on a 3-day program that I did for the German aid agencies and their partners around managing change. They said to me, come and do something on managing change. And they invited their German people, you know, their expatriate experts, and they'd invited the people who they partnered with in government. And this woman, her name is Lita Geza. Lita came to this training program and she said, I want you to come and do something in the province. And the province had just been through a thing which they called the Provincial Transformation Strategy. And they had all the what if they wanted to transform. They had no idea how to transform it. So I ended up working there over years with sometimes a very big team of people, 8 or 10 consultants, on analyzing the culture of the 13 departments in the province, from health, education, et cetera. And Lita had recruited a small group from each department. So we had all of these people in the room. There were 110 people in a huge banqueting hall in a hotel. And I was standing on a stage with a microphone rigged up, you know, and I had to put them through a 3-day emotional intelligence leadership program. That was how we started with them, with the Telios program, their resonant leadership program. And Annie came out and Eddie Mwelwa came out and later Fran. So I had real backup from Telios, but I had to stand up, and after all the dignitaries had made their speeches about how important this was, I had to really put my arms around, literally and figuratively, these people who came from 13 different organizations and say to them, we are going on this journey together. Every single one of them except 2 were Black. And there's me, a white, middle-aged woman standing on a stage higher than them with a microphone, and I have to enroll them in this process. I was terrified. My introvert self was jumping up and down inside of me. And I'm never a person who on a night out will stand up and do karaoke or whatever. I can't do that. You know? So this microphone thing was freaking me out completely. And I took a moment and I went back to my training and I said to myself, what is the presence that is missing in this system? What is the presence that will bring something different? What do I know about the culture of the Xhosa people and how to build relationship? This is not a province that I'd grown up in, so I had to kind of, I didn't have any felt experience that was really meaningful. And I just went with everything that I knew, and it worked. It worked. And sort of a few years later, I was sort of deep in the system, because we then went into the departments with these change agents supporting them. And then I got an extra piece of work to go into the Department of Education. And I walked into one of the district offices, really in a very poor town. And I walked down the passage, and one of the guys who'd been in the program came towards me, and he was like, "Hello, Chantelle." I was like, "Hello." And he says, "Oh, when we see you coming, we pull up our socks." I said to him, "Why?" And like, I didn't know I had that effect on people, so I was getting all silly about it. And he said, "No," he says, "when you come, we step into a better version of ourselves. We start to watch ourselves, because this is what you have taught us." And then he sailed off down the passage, and I thought, okay, that's interesting. Yeah. So it was something, it's not about what I was saying, it was about how I used myself in the process. And it was very scary in the beginning with these huge groups. And it was an amazing process to go through. And over the last, so that was 2013 or so, over the last 7 years, every now and again I meet one of those people, and they say that those workshops and those processes we did have changed their lives, how they see themselves, how they manage themselves, how they manage their relationships, how they parent their children. So it's been an extraordinary privilege to be able to put myself out there, however terrifying and challenging it was. Yeah.
And this is sort of almost the storytelling question, is whether you identify one of your greatest moments or most impactful memories or experiences within Gestalt, either as a trainer, practitioner, therapist, client, student, person. What comes to mind when I ask that?
A very beautiful story. When we were working on the HIV/AIDS leadership program with Annie and Fran and the Telios team, we convened smaller groups in which people were sort of doing their personal work, because we were quite clear that even though there were cultural taboos around this, we had to get into issues of sexuality and sexual practice, and sexual behavior with people, because of the way in which the virus was spreading in Africa. And I facilitated a group in which, so this program was a diverse program, but there were only 2 white people in it. It was big. There were 85 people. There were only 2 white people, and a couple of people who in South Africa we would call colored. They're slightly different origin, and then mostly African people of African origin. And I was facilitating a small group with the white guy in the group, and this guy, you won't mind me naming him. His name is Brett Anderson. He's an HIV activist and media personality, and a beautiful blonde gay man, really attractive, very outspoken and expressive. And in the group, I had a real range of people, but a very quiet, conservative African man from a rural area who was a devout Catholic. And Brett was being himself and being really exuberant and speaking all about his sexuality and this and that. And I could see some of how this was being received in the group. But worked really hard to hold the group, and we'd done a lot of work about multiple realities, etc. And after a while, this gentleman who came, this Catholic gentleman, started to cry. It was a very emotional moment. And what he spoke about was that his son was gay. And he'd been struggling with this. And he turned to Brett and he said, through you being yourself, I've learned to love my son again. I feel very teary talking about it. And the specialness of being able to hold that conversation and the responsibility of that was very gratifying and very important for me. And I see Brett from time to time around and about, and he was in touch with that man for a very long time and became a kind of confidant for him in helping this guy to come to terms with something that was culturally very difficult for him to deal with, culturally and religiously very difficult. So, you know, that was a very special moment for me. And working across different boundaries to the kind of racial separation boundaries that are usual. I mean, here there was a racial difference, but what was most important was around the sexual identity and also the religious aspect. It was a beautiful, beautiful conversation.
Well, sorry, I'm just sort of taking this all in. This has been really lovely to meet with you. The last question that I do have for you is about the future. I know you said you're not in the legacy phase yet, but I'm curious in two sort of paths, which is what you're interested in doing in the future and where you think Gestalt is going or where you would like to see it go in the future.
Oh, wow. I think for me, what's become, I've gotten a lot of feedback in the work that I do on the little 2-day program, in some of my writing. People say that I make Gestalt very understandable for them, and I've got a way of describing, for example, resistances. That's one of the things I love to share with people and teach. So one of the things that I want to do more of is to write more. And I'm very grateful. I work with people who write, like Marianne Rainey. So she's recently done a wonderful book with Brenda Jones and asked me to write a piece in that. So I have colleagues who push me, but there are other things that I would like to write, because I do think Gestalt has an important history and a depth to its theory that I think is worth putting it out in the world more, especially the application and the different interesting ways in which it's used. So that's something I want to do a little bit more of. And actually, what's interesting, yesterday I had this one team that I coach, which works on city planning support. So they're technical people, they're planners, engineers, etc. And they need to take the work that they're doing and get it integrated into government. So they work as a sort of team on the edge of government, and now they need to get government officials to do what they're doing. So I did a little workshop with them on influencing and being a change agent. And I had a little diagram with little stick figures. I do have a virtual version of this one. a stick figure on the boundary of a system. And I talked to them about what it means to be a change agent on the boundary. And it's lonely and you're entering a system, you know, all those kind of things that we do in Gestalt. And they were bowled over. It was like my reading of it that I named their experience, and they weren't even aware that that experience was somehow exceptional, let alone had tried to describe it. And that was very exciting for them. These are never people that are going to be Gestalt coaches or anything. These are technical people, and they need some basic language to describe what their process, rather, you know, they're always in the content of their work, to use Sonia's distinction. They're in the content of their work. You know, I need to do a better transport system in this city.
Right, but it's not just described their self in the world with the other.
Exactly, yeah. And they're struggling with it all the time, and nobody had ever named that and talked about it. So one of them wrote back to me and said, oh, I printed out that diagram. I've got it on the wall next to my desk. This is my life. And then I thought to myself, I'm sure I've written something on this before. So I scratched out a little article I wrote for an OD magazine on Gestalt OD. And there was a whole half a page on the role of the intervener. But it's written for OD people. And I had it on my screen all day today. And I thought, you know, damn it, I should rewrite this little article for like leaders and managers. Take out the OD language and say, when you want to influence your clients, or when you want to whatever your team, and just make it kind of basic and practical. And so this is what I think that Gestalt has many more applications than training coaches or training facilitators or training OD people or training HR people in organizations. And even in the frame of our iGold and IOSD programs, and we were aware of that, we were not attending to the experience of managers and leaders enough. And in iGold, that's why we put the L in the leadership part in. We've shifted to that. But even when we are running the program, we're often aware, oh, we're not attending to people like that, who works in the upper echelons of government, of the African Union. We've had a lot of people from the African Union. These are people that deal with multiple political systems in the African Union or the African Commission. They're based in Addis Ababa. They have to articulate with, you know, other regional governments like the European Commission. You know, how do we help them in exactly this, describing their process of themselves and others in the world? So I think there's some application areas of Gestalt that are enormously powerful and potentially kind of life-changing for people, in terms of their identities and how they see themselves. So that's what's interesting me these days. And just another PS I'm thinking about, I'm helping a program in South Africa, which is based in the higher education area, with Black PhDs, mainly Black PhDs. And it's about the people that are going to be the future professors, the future scholars in our universities. And it's taking 25 of the top scholars who are going to be A-rated academics. You know, there's this rating system in academia. And I'm doing some coaching work with them. And I need to think about how can some of these frames help them to understand this identity, because the scholarly identity is different to a social, you know, one's social identity. It's a very particular identity. And what does it mean to develop an African scholarly identity? And there's all this debate about the Africanization of our universities. And so there's something there that people are struggling with. And I'm thinking, you know, maybe I need to start thinking about that identity in Gestalt terms. So yeah, that's interesting me at the moment.
I'm just, yeah, just listening to all of your energy and all of these little sparks that just go off. And I love the way that you become so energized in all of these different directions and with such clarity. It's truly remarkable. So
thank you. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the future professors like that. So that was, yeah, that was
I'm glad this
really
could
helpful.
be useful for you to reflect on. So is there anything that you would like to add right now?
I think I would like to add a tribute, a couple of tributes. I would like to add a tribute to John Nkum, whose name has come up a couple of times, my Ghanaian colleague, who we both went into we were the first two Africans in the international program that Edwin started with John O'Hannigan and Carolyn Lucas-Meyer. And John and I have worked together over the years, both in the development sector and in working on the iGold and the IOSD program. And John is an extraordinary man, and you know, as a white South African coming from a very separated, racially separated world, John caused me, knowing John and the presence of John, caused me to explore a lot of stuff around myself. And I've told him this, I can say it up front here, that when I met him, I had never met a Black person in my life in South Africa who was much, much smarter and better educated than me. And he stood his ground because we lived in very separate worlds. And even the university I went to, all my lecturers were white, or came from the US or whatever. It was an awful situation looking back. And meeting John with his absolute intellect and his huge heart shifted my sense of myself so extraordinarily. And he continues to do that. It may not mean terribly much to you, Heather, or some of the listeners, because rugby is something that you don't often watch in your worlds. But rugby is a very big sport in South Africa. It used to be a very Afrikaner sport, and now there are a lot of wonderful young Black rugby players, and we won the World Cup last year. And John, and why I'm mentioning this is that John and I were invited to facilitate the strategic planning of the SA Rugby management the year before the World Cup. And it was in the facilitated session that we did for 2 days with them that they came up with their plan to win the World Cup. And John doesn't even know how to spell rugby, because in Ghana they play football or soccer. And you know, my knowledge of rugby was a bit negligible. And when our team won the World Cup and electrified the country and the continent in the process, John and I got a text because it was set in Japan, we got a text from Japan saying, thank you, and it was the work we did with you that started this journey. So John and I giggle with each other all the time that we did this funky piece of work together where we helped South Africa win the Rugby World Cup.
The white South African librarian helped win the Rugby World Cup. Okay.
And John, and we have an incredible coach who has driven the racial transformation strategy of rugby, so that the national team is like mainly Black and etc. He's incredible. So I have a photograph of him. He's a huge man, an ex-rugby player, this huge man with me and John, who's shorter than me. And so you know, I want to give a tribute to John, because we've done quiet work behind the scenes with each other around race, around the development of Africa. And we continue to do that, and it even gets us into places like rugby. But you know, I'm speaking to Edwin's confidence in us all those years ago when he gave us this scholarship to do the program. And of course, on the edges of my relationship with John is Jochen, Nathaniel Mjema, all the other colleagues who have brought Gestalt to Africa and into the development world, and have had the vision, which we've all been part of. And then, of course, you know, people like John O'Hannigan and Marianne Rainey, who've been with us the whole journey and have come to South Africa and at very little financial incentive run programs for me here, influenced people, supported people in government. The Deputy Speaker of the South African Parliament, Lachisa Tsenoli, is a graduate of our programs. He's an alumni of our programs. So, you know, quietly, people have given of themselves to support Gestalt in Africa in very extraordinary ways. So right the way back to Edwin, who had the vision, Sonia, you know, Jochen probably said in his interview that Sonia said, I don't travel anymore. Jochen got Sonia to come to Cape Town. And people said, how the hell did you? People all over the world had been trying to get Sonia Nevis to come to them. And she was like, nope. She came to Cape Town, and Jochen did that because she said, I believe in you and the work that you're doing. So I want to give a tribute to people who've supported us in our work and supported the dream of a better Africa. And we're still busy with it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Oh, well, thank you. That's all I would say. Thank you very much for sharing all of this and for your time this morning, this afternoon for you.
Yeah. Thank you, Heather. Thank you. I've enjoyed thinking back to from my grandfather to people who influenced me, and yeah, to the rugby. It was a very proud triumph to know that when the scoreboard went up and we hoisted the trophy, I was like, Gestalt was there. Yeah, great.
Thank you very much.